even in this sort of a climate, we're here, and I've had experience with having sessions at Catalyst, a couple of them, and they've been, I think, just to sum up, the essence of it would be as interactive, as dynamic as possible. And I do definitely acknowledge the challenges that come with this particular medium as well, which is why I also want to again reiterate exactly like Sir said, that we do need to make this an interactive sort of a session. So I do understand that the general vibe of this medium is very lectury. So that's not the vibe that I go for at all. So that's why I would really appreciate if our session today is as interactive as can be. And again, I do understand that this is a sensitive topic. So if at any point you do feel like you want to share, but you don't want to tell everyone, you can privately send me a message. I think that is an avenue that's available on this session. And again, there's no pressure to sort of talk about like personal experiences and stuff like that, because this can be a sort of a touchy topic. And I think it's also important for us to be as sensitive as possible when we're over here talking about mental health. So I think that's just the general sort of space that we should be operating from when it comes to our session today. So again, you can unmute your mic and ask me a question at any point. Feel free to do that. Again, if you feel like you don't sort of feel comfortable with that, the chat option is always available. So you can shoot me a private message or whatever that works for you, and I'll have that answered as well as I can. Okay, so yeah, another thing that I think is very, very important for our session is feedback. So I would really appreciate if all of you could, give me feedback about how the session went, what went well for you, what didn't go well for you, what you would want us to do better, change, include, remove, stuff like that. So I think all my contact credentials are available. If not, you can definitely direct it through Sir as well. So I think that's something that I am very, very encouraging of. So I would really appreciate if everyone could give me some feedback so that we can make these webinars and sessions more comprehensive and inclusive for everyone. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, we begin. But before we begin, I think it's important to set out some disclaimers, set out some sort of pointers that all of us should be careful about. Given that this is a discussion on mental health, it is only fair to put across trigger warnings. So we will be touching upon topics of abuse and suicide at a particular point in our discussion. So I'm just letting you know this is a trigger warning that we will be discussing that. And again, if you're not comfortable engaging in that conversation, that's totally okay. And just be comfortable and look after yourself. I think that's just the general vibe that again is a part of this session. And finally, a huge thank you to all of you who've shown up today for our session. I think that this is a topic that is so sensitive and generally in normal circumstances is completely misunderstood. So coming here to understand it in the context of a pandemic is our effort to sort of make these issues more visible. So I'm really grateful that all of us can show up today and engage in these conversations today, because what we're also doing, the goal that I do have with the session today, if nothing, is just to demystify the process of therapy, because that does happen to be quite an abstract space that we don't really know how it operates, right? So the first goal that I would go for is demystifying therapy for all of us. And the second, again, would be to normalize conversations around mental health and to make them more visible. And with that, I think another thing that I would also recommend for all of us to do is just to tap into our own internal world and reflect on our own sort of experiences of mental health up until today in this pandemic. What has changed? How have I changed as a person? And what am I doing as an individual facing this very grave situation to look after myself? So again, this medium can be quite a one-way sort of an exchange. So I also want to say that this will be if not will be, at least the goal is that it is going to be a human conversation. We are talking about a lot of intimate things and also talking about things that are very close to our personal experience. So my goal for today is going to keep the academic jargon to the minimal. So I feel like when we use statistics and when we use research, which is great, it's very, very important to have all of those numbers and all of those details in place, but at the same time I think it's also important to spend some time on the actual human experience of what we're going through. So I think that's what I'm going to be doing today, is keeping the academic sort of jargon to the minimal, drawing a lot from my own experiences in therapy, in practice, and also getting some sort of recommendations from you in terms of how this space, which was evolving before, is evolving even more now. So again, the floor is open for all the recommendations that can come along to sort of make this process of therapy for everyone as comfortable as possible. Like the topic says, that therapy as a practice is changing because of the pandemic. So we will not only be looking at challenges or changes, we'll also be going to looking at possible solutions, right? So we have something tangible to take away from here. Now, so ideally, if this were like a face-to-face sort of a session where we're all in a room together, I would encourage everyone to sort of, just pitch in a little bit at this point to discuss what, your motivations are from this session, right? So what do you think, your sort of motivations are? What made you sign up? What made you sort of show up for the session today? So if you could unmute, you can unmute and just share, or you could just put it across on chat and let me know. So yeah, the floor is open for that. Let's spend a couple of minutes on that to just sound out those thoughts. All right. Okay, we're having a bunch of responses coming in. Can we have everyone just sending me some messages so that I get to know where everyone's at with regards to their sort of expectations from the session today?
Hi, ma'am.
Hi, is this
Uh,
Pritha?
yes, ma'am.
Great, hi.
So my motivation for joining today's session was to know how therapy essentially is going to change in the wake of this pandemic. More so because now we are feeling, some of us are feeling, um, we want to know how this is going to change, because some of us are not comfortable taking therapy sessions via phone, or they're waiting for the pandemic or the lockdown to end so they could reach out
Mm,
and have a more face to face the conversations that they had before, the kind of
mm,
conversations that they had before, they want to have the same type of conversations now, which is not possible. and which is also hampering the mental health because they'll be waiting for the right time, and then going. So this is what I wanted to know. How is this going to change? How can we? What is the solution to this?
Hmm. Absolutely. I think this is something that I feel very strongly about as well. And like you said, that phone, video, these mediums don't really capture the essence of therapy in terms of the human connect. And you've got that bang on. And I do have a huge chunk of the session today that's spent on that. And I will sort of share a lot of my thoughts that I have on it. I have a lot of thoughts about that. So yeah, I think also a bunch of people telling me about how this is also time for all of us to be very empathetic to each other, and how we need to be kind to ourselves and to other people during this time. So I think it's important that we also sort of make sure that this is a goal that we're all working towards. um, yeah, any other thoughts, any other ideas about, what we can spend some time on in our session? What motivated you to, register? All right, I think we've got a good number of responses. So just to sort of sum up everything, I think it's important that, like Pritha said, that we need to figure out how we can make the process of therapy more comprehensive, more inclusive, more human. And again, we also need to be empathetic to people, kind to people, and how, we can sort of work towards that goal is definitely, I think, a very, very good way of taking forward our session today. And I'm really glad to everyone who sort of shared, what their thoughts are. Thanks a lot. I do understand, and I will reiterate this again and again, as I do in most of my sessions, is that this is a different medium to be on. So this if this does sort of take some time for you to adapt to, that's totally fine. If at any point you feel like things are going too fast, slow, feel free to let me know. The stage is open. You can send me a private message on chat and I can address everything there. Right. So cool, let's move on to the rest of our session. All right. So, before we sort of delve into how therapy as a process has changed in the context of the pandemic, I think it's important to first spend some time on what therapy as a practice looks like. Because therapy as a practice, even before the pandemic, was a very ambiguous and abstract space, very misunderstood as well, I would say. A lot of Western media does have reflections of therapy spaces in their shows and movies, etc. Some get it right, some don't. A lot of our experiences are also based on our personal experiences of therapy. Again, some go right, some don't. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that this perspective on therapy, again, is the perspective that I have evolved from my own practice, from my own readings, from drawing from other people's sort of ideas about therapy. And as you can probably see on your screen, this is a quote that's drawn from Irvin Yalom. And Yalom is an American existential psychotherapist. And he says that therapy should not be theory driven, but relationship driven. And I think this quote has stuck with me for a really long time. And that's because, we do focus quite a bit on, the theoretical inclinations. We think a lot about, okay, diseases, symptoms, we think about disorders. We don't really pay attention to the process of therapy. So I think what I'm going to be doing now for the next few minutes is spending some time on what this process looks like, at least from this perspective, that why the relationship needs to be the forefront of a therapy relationship. Okay, so for anyone who sort of had any sort of an exposure to psychology as a discipline would know that the therapeutic relationship is given a lot of importance. And while that is something that's universal for all therapists, there will be difference in terms of the perspective that a therapist takes in their practice. So you could have someone who's, drawing a lot from the psychodynamic, stream of thought. There will be someone who will be drawing a lot from the existential stream of thought, behavioral stream of thought. So those are sort of individual choices and decisions that everyone makes on the basis of their own space that they come from. But I think the overarching sort of universal theme in therapy is the relationship, right? So we focus on content a lot. Okay, we focus on anxiety, depression. What does it look like? What is that experience like? If I am depressed, what do my symptoms look like? And you will at some point of the session today understand why I'm air quoting all of these words. So I think we also need to spend some time on the process of therapy. While the content is extremely important, the process of therapy is equally important, if not more important. Okay, so I am focusing on this particular quote because also for anyone who is interested in psychology and for anyone who's interested in therapy as a process, there is a book that Yalom has written, which is great. This quote is also drawn from that book. It's called The Gift of Therapy, which takes you through the process of therapy beautifully. It talks about what the world of therapy really looks like for the client and for the therapist and the space in between, right? So what we're going to be spending some time on is the relationship that is shared between the relationship that is shared between the just hold on, relationship that is shared between the therapist and the client. So Astha, the name of the book is The Gift of Therapy. It's by Irvin Yalom. I do have a PDF, so I can share it after the session is over and it can sort of go across to everybody. Okay, all right. So with this, I think you do sort of hear me focusing a lot on the process of therapy, right? And then you'd ask me, what does process mean? Like, what is the purpose of process in therapy? So process, to put it, in very simple terms, would mean the space that a therapist and a client shares in a session. Okay, so what is the therapeutic relationship like? What are the dynamics that are, at play with regards to that space? Okay, so is this a therapeutic relationship where, the client is reliant on the therapist or resistant towards the therapist? So those things are reflective of the client's inner world and the client's internal experience. So we have to understand that a client comes to session with their experience. We as therapists are not observers of their experience in real life. Okay, so we sort of go with just whatever that they tell us from their lives. So we also have to focus a lot on the process through which they tell us things and the sort of relationship that we share with each other to gain insights into what that world really looks like for them. Okay, so there is an example that I use to sort of explain this, is again drawn from Yalom's explanation of therapy, is that therapy is an extremely spontaneous and complex process. Okay, so to explain this, there is this sort of an anecdote that he talks about, is that, his therapy room or therapy office is located in the small cottage in a garden. Okay, so to reach that cottage, you need to walk, let's say, 100 feet through a garden to reach the cottage and then sort of enter and, start your session. So every single client who comes through and, goes ahead with that journey of 100 feet of the garden journey, they have a very different experience of it. Some will really appreciate the plantation that's around and the trees that are around, and they're really appreciative of that. Some are annoyed that, why is the path so muddy, why don't you get it cleaned up? And some are just sort of not fazed by that at all. So all of those things are also reflections of the client's inner world and the space that you share with the client. So I think it's important also to shed some attention on those things as well, along with the content that is coming up because of the pandemic as well. So having said that, this is a complex sort of a space, very intimate relationship that you share with your therapist. So what I am noticing these days as a result of the pandemic is that it's great that conversations around mental health have increased a lot, is what I'm noticing. That's amazing. And it also seems to me that everyone seems to have their 2 cents to share about mental health. And it's becoming more of a one size fits all conversation, that you have to be productive or you don't have to be productive, and anyone who doesn't fit into those boxes feels very confused about what are we supposed to be doing to deal with our mental health. So I think the first and foremost idea that I want all of you to sort of take away with is that your mental health experience is personal to you. So it does not have to fit into boxes of just what the dominant narrative is and what everyone's sort of doing or saying. So it's important also for therapists, and if there are any trainee therapists or people who are interested in pursuing a career in psychology, is this idea that you need to have a different therapy for different clients, right? So one perspective is not going to fit for all your clients. So if you do assume one particular approach and you think, oh well, that worked really great with this client, let me try it with all of them, that's not going to work. So it has to be a very personal sort of um, personalized sort of an approach with regards to how you're dealing with your clients and what is the sort of space that you're sharing with them. And finally, I think what is the most important thing about therapy is, again, drawing from Yalom, is the fact that you and your client are going to be fellow travelers in this process of therapy. So the general idea of a therapist and a client is that the therapist is the expert. The therapist knows what they're talking about because they're trained and all of that. So whatever the therapist says is set in stone. But I think that perpetuates a lot of power dynamics which are absolutely unnecessary and not useful when it comes to um, the process of therapy at all. So we need to understand that you are embarking on a journey with your client, and you are exploring that space with your client as a fellow traveler, not as an expert on their experience, because it is their experience and you are not a judge of their experience. Okay, so I think this is not only useful for people who are training to be therapists or interested in the discipline, but also for people who are looking for mental health support and what you can expect from your therapist, right? So if you do notice your therapist doing certain things that are pushing a certain sort of a discipline or technique on you, or trying to be a judge of your experience or assuming a more of an expert position, and I would say that you could probably reflect on how that's going for you, and just generally how you feel about it. So yeah, this was just a gist of what the process of therapy is supposed to look like, because we do focus a lot on the symptoms and the disorders, but we need to also focus on the relationship that we're sharing in the therapeutic space. So having said that, I will move on to um, our next point, which is going to be the challenges, which, as Pritha pointed out, also yeah, as Pritha pointed out, the shift to online and telehealth mediums, right? So what happens when you shift to online mediums? So typically what I'm noticing that a lot of us are doing with therapy is that we are taking sessions online. Video sessions are happening, which is sort of just the rule of thumb right now. And you'd say that but online sessions were a reality even before the pandemic hit. Why is this becoming such major chunk of our session today? I would say that online sessions earlier, pre-pandemic, were I would say they were not the norm. They were just adjustments that we make to certain obstacles to access, right? So because we don't have access, this is the next best option that we have. What's happened now is that our next best option is our only option now. So we are having to adapt to a new space that we're not necessarily acquainted with. And this holds true for therapists and clients. So if any of you are sort of users of this service, you will also notice that, the adjustment to an online space has been challenging for you as well. And it has been for therapists too. So one of the most important things that happened with this transition to online spaces has been the loss of a therapy space. Okay, so I have spent a lot of time talking about how important the therapeutic relationship is, and how that is a universal sort of theme that is prevalent in all practices regardless of your theoretical inclinations. However, the loss of a therapeutic space, and by space I mean the physical space, the four walls that enclose the room, the two chairs that you have, the sort of general room that you're in when you go in for therapy, that's completely gone away. So um, I like to explain this with an example which has stayed with me for a really long time. And this was a thought that I had way in the beginning of the pandemic, way in the beginning of the lockdown, sorry. And this was something that, I've been discussing with other sort of practitioners as well. And this has been a problem, I wouldn't say a problem, but an issue for a lot of us. And so there was a history professor who asked a question to his students for extra credit that, if there was one COVID-19 artifact that you could give to a historian 100 years from now for an exhibit, what would you give to them? Right? So what is that one thing, that one artifact that's going to reflect these times that we're living in? Except these artifacts cannot be medical at all. So no masks, no sort of hospital beds, etc., etc. So it's more of like a human example. So the responses to this question were very powerful. So a lot of the students said things like, unfinished things, unfinished business that was left that couldn't be completed. So for instance, a post-it note that a healthcare worker has left for their child that, hey, I'm going to work, food is in the fridge. So those things are reflective of what this experience has been like for a lot of us in this pandemic. Unfinished business, abandoned things, degrees that we couldn't carry forward, vacations we couldn't go on, plans that completely fell apart. So the major sort of theme when it came to this question was things were left unfinished and abandoned. So when I got to thinking about what was that one artifact that I would sort of give to this historian 100 years from now to tell them, this is what mental health looked like during the pandemic, is the abandoned therapy room. It's empty. There's no one there. So what happens with an abandoned therapy room? So I'll walk you through the process of, how I transitioned from an online, from a face-to-face medium to an online medium. So the lockdown again was quite sudden. The transition, I would say, was quite sudden. So the way I sort of worked around it was writing mass emails to a lot of my clients saying that, okay, so this is happening and we need to sort of shift online. So, just letting you know, there will be adjustments, we'll work with them, take your time, and sort of left it with, how are you coping with this? How's everything going with you? Is everybody safe? Yeah, so this was just the general theme of emails that went out to all of my clients to address this pandemic situation that we were in. So the responses to that, I think, have stuck with me even now, even after like 60-65 days. So a lot of my clients responded back asking me how I was doing, asking me if I was safe, if my family is safe. Then another example would be of someone who, let me just stop sharing this. Yeah. So another example would be of this client who said, thanks a lot for checking on me. This is the first time someone even bothered to check on me, which was, painful, heartbreaking, but also a reality for a lot of people. And third example was, hey, my parents are on a grocery run. Can we quickly have a session before they come back? Yeah. So this was an adjustment for therapists, sure, but it has been an adjustment for clients as well, because I think while we are acknowledging the physical space of therapy, we also have to acknowledge what that space symbolized for us, right? So what does that space, what does that room mean for me? What does that room mean for all of my clients? So to explain that, another example was when a client said that, I miss taking myself on a therapy reward date. So what he would do is that he would go to a cafe after every session, treat himself with a cup of coffee, that good job looking after your mental health, great. And that is something that he misses a lot. So the process of, getting in the car, getting in a vehicle, coming for therapy, that transition from, I'm living my life to I'm going to therapy, that transition completely went away. People just completely lost their entire routine that was around going for therapy. So that was a huge loss for a lot of us, in the mental health space, that the sort of process that is involved in preparing yourself for therapy completely went away. And like Pritha as well asked, is that what can we do to make this a human sort of a process as it is supposed to be? So the way I have sort of worked around this problem is that, recommending this to clients and for myself and in our process also, is we replicate the actual process as much as possible. We replicate the real face-to-face process as much as possible. So for instance, if my client says that I want to go on a therapy reward date, to reward myself for looking after my mental health, that's not something that's possible because of the lockdown. So what can we do in this given situation to reward yourself? Can we look for different rewards? Can we look for a coffee date you can take yourself on at home? Maybe you go to a space that is like a balcony or a terrace where you feel like, okay, I can get like a change of environment and I am rewarding myself for this, right? So the general crux of this problem, I wouldn't call it a problem, this issue, is that you replicate the real face-to-face process as much as you can. So this holds good for people who are users and also for therapists. Um, with that, I think what's a very pressing issue again is the problem of boundaries, right? So when it comes to online sessions like this, for instance, all of you are now sitting in my room and you know what my space looks like, right? So when it happens in a therapy session, my client can see, where I am, what, my space looks like. Is this my room? Is this an office? What is this? And at the same time, I can see their personal space as well, right? So I think when I was reflecting on this quite a bit, it felt almost like a breach of privacy, that am I an invited guest here? Do they want me to be privy to all of these things that are around them? Do they want me to know that their walls are yellow? Do they want me to know what sort of a mug they're drinking their coffee in, right? So it does feel like we're too involved and too into each other's spaces, even though we're not physically there yet, right? So having said that, like I said, a lot of people don't have access to those spaces because therapy is not still talked about enough. So if I'm at home, I'm living with my parents, and I don't want them to know that I am taking sessions for therapy, how do I work around that? How do I, have a session without them knowing that, I'm in therapy? So a lot of them have sort of, again, worked around spaces that I can go to. Is there a balcony? Is there a terrace? Can I sit in a car and, have my session? So again, these adjustments unfortunately are happening to at least have access to therapy, because I feel like the major mantra here is, something's better than nothing. The major mantra of this pandemic has been this. um, but still, I do feel like making adjustments to this is very important. So like I said, that, the client who said that, my parents are on a grocery run, can we quickly have a session? So on any other sort of occasion, it would be questionable. It would, maybe I would not sort of heed to that request, because again, boundaries. But given the sort of situation that we're in, we do have to sort of readjust our position when it comes to our sort of practice as well. So then you do make yourself more available. You do make your clients more accessible to you, and you're also making this process more flexible. So I think this is what the loss of a therapy space has looked like. It has been a collective loss for a lot of us. I think what all of us have acknowledged in this entire pandemic lockdown situation is that we've lost so much. We've lost a life that we used to live. It's completely gone away. We've lost routines of self-care that have completely gone away. We have lost our professional identity does not exist in the same way anymore. That's gone. So even in this space of mental health and therapy, we have lost the therapeutic space. And um, I did sort of spend some time on, okay, how can we deal with this? How do we manage this loss? But I think it's also important, which I learned as I went along, was that you sit with the loss, you address the loss, you talk about it with your clients, you tell them that this is not the best situation, but it is what it is, and it's okay for us to feel bad that we don't have that space anymore. So right now, after 65 days, I do have clients who keep asking me, when are we going to resume? When are we going to start seeing each other face to face? And it's just that frustration of not having that human connect. Like, for instance, right now, all I can see is myself. So I don't know at all what is the sort of what are the thoughts that are going on in your head, right? Because that's something that is completely inaccessible to me right now. So given that the lockdown has sort of eased out and a lot of businesses are now resuming, what does that mean for therapy face to face, right? So realistically, is it possible for us to maintain 6 feet distance in a session? Sure, we can. But again, it takes away from the intimacy of the process. So a lot of people who rightfully so don't understand the process of therapy as well will say, we need to keep business moving as usual, so why don't you just go with your masks on, and your client can wear a mask and you can wear a mask and everything's fine. But what we need to acknowledge with a mask in a session is that more than half of your face is covered, right? So when I talk about process, and when I talk about the non-verbal cues that are also very important in the process of therapy, that completely goes out of the window, right? So I will not know at all what is this person experiencing or feeling, because their face is covered by a mask. They will not know what I am sort of experiencing, because my face is covered by a mask. So the process becomes completely compromised, in my opinion, that a mask is something that will take away a lot of the process that is sort of unseen, which is why I've spent so much time on the process and not really the content of mental health, which I will come to eventually. So Yeah, I think the way I see it right now is that if I had to choose between online sessions, telehealth, telephonic sessions over face-to-face sessions with a mask, I would still pick online sessions and virtual sessions over that. Um, Simply because that the safety is definitely, counted for and accounted for, sorry, and again, it less is lost in the process, I feel. With online with face-to-face sessions with a mask, I think too much goes away. So that's where I'm at, and I'd be, more than happy to hear what everyone's thoughts are about this, and what your recommendations would be to sort of counter this problem of a loss of a therapy space for all of us. um, and yeah, I would be more than happy to sort of see what everyone has going on their mind with regards to this first major change that we discussed with regards to the pandemic. So I'm just going to take a mini water break. So in the meantime, if anyone has any sort of questions, feel free to sort of shoot them across. Okay, so the next thing that I will move on to is the next point is boundaries in therapy, which I briefly touched upon even in the loss of therapy space. But again, boundaries are something that are becoming a lot more fluid now in therapy. So therapists are having to be a lot more flexible with their availability, accessibility. Clients also have to be sort of fluid when it comes to accessing therapy. And by saying that, I will use an example. For instance, we are in session, and if I am having an internet problem, or my client is having an internet problem, they can't hear me, they can't see me, how much time am I going to give them extra to make up for this lag, right? So the rule of the book says that 50 minutes to 1 hour is enough for a session. You should not ideally do more than that, right? But if in the meantime you do notice that things are not going as smoothly, you're losing a lot of time because of connectivity, you have to give them more time, and you have to sort of make yourself available to be giving them the time that they deserve. So again, over here, I think what's important is, again, it could possibly be going a bit too technical, is scheduling. So when you are scheduling sessions with clients, or you are scheduling a session with your therapist, keeping like a half an hour sort of window where you can just account for any sort of you know overshooting that can happen. So yeah, definitely boundaries are definitely becoming a lot more fluid when it comes to therapy during the pandemic. And therapy with children, I think, is something that is not getting attention at all. Because if I were to sort of reflect back on my experience with children in therapy, then if I put myself in those shoes right now and imagine how I would carry on therapy with them, it would be very challenging for me to do. So just to give you a quick background of what my work with children has been like, I was working with children at a school in Bombay, in an area called Govandi, which is, I would say, a Muslim dominated area which does not have access to the privileges that they should be given. Okay, so there is just a lot of violence there is a lot of systemic oppression that's happening, and that's why I made sure to say that they were Muslim, because that's just the sort of understanding that because of their religion they're not being given access to those services. So to quickly walk you through what my experience there was like, was that most of the work that I was doing there with children, I would say from third standard to, I was seeing students from third standard to 10th standard. And usually with the younger ones, you do engage in a lot of expressive modalities. So by expressive modalities, I mean art and play. You use a lot of those modalities to understand the world of the child. Now with online sessions, that becomes quite challenging, because it's difficult to replicate play and art over a Zoom call or over a Skype session. So I think, unfortunately, children are sort of being left out of this space completely, which is unfortunate, and again is something for you to think about in terms of what are your recommendations, or what are the things that you think could be solutions to the problem. How do we make sure that children also have access to therapy, right? So I am not actively working with children right now, but the way I see it again is just the presence of the therapist, right? We don't have to be doing active therapy work with them, but just knowing that the therapist is there. So even if the therapist gets on a Zoom call and is just sharing space with the child, playing a game maybe, is something that's a good idea to sort of work around this obstacle that we have with children in the pandemic and therapy with them. Um, Finally, I come to accessibility as a double-edged sword, because when we talk about accessibility, a lot of people say that this is great. Online sessions mean that I can have sessions with any therapist I want. Doesn't have to be a therapist in my city. So with that, which is great, it's great, but then we have to ask the question that who are we making this accessible to, right? So we are making this accessible to a very specific population that does have access to internet and does have access to online payments, does have access to laptops, phones. So if we are talking about accessibility, a lot of people are being missed out of this conversation, and I think it's important for us to be very mindful of the fact that it is a double-edged sword. So if it is something that is a positive, there are a lot of negatives attached to it as well, and it's important for us to be mindful of those limitations. So yeah, I now move on to my next yeah my next topic for our session would be the themes that are emerging in therapy. So I've spent some time on the process, and I've spent some time on the challenges that are coming across in the process of therapy. But it's also important to sort of spend some time on the themes that are emerging, which are very specific to the pandemic. So again, a disclaimer is that this is not an exhaustive list of themes that have emerged. This is something that has stood out a lot for me in my sessions, and something that I am actively working on with my clients, and just here to sort of share my 2 cents on these issues and how we can navigate them. And again, I think the biggest takeaway from this part of the session is realizing that, oh, I'm going through this as well, so I'm not alone here. So a lot of you would probably be feeling lonely because you're quarantining alone, or you could be sort of feeling the pressure of productivity. And when I spend some time talking about this, I hope that you can um, realize that you're not alone, and this is something that a lot of us are going through, and it's okay to feel this way, and it's okay if nothing is making sense right now. It's totally okay. So the first three things that I will spend time on are loneliness, reframing self-care and productivity, and increase in the number of suicides. So loneliness again has been a challenge for people who are quarantining alone, has also been a challenge for people who are quarantining with people that they don't want to be with. So that feeling of loneliness is pervasive, because we don't have access to the people that we want to meet, and we're constantly sort of just in that same loop of life. So I think that has been a major theme that I have worked on in sessions. And I think, again, having said that, like I said, the mantra of this pandemic has been, something's better than nothing. So what do I have at my disposal that I can work with to deal with this loneliness? So virtual access to people is something that, is what we're doing as well. So, how do we tackle loneliness is through those avenues of virtual access. And again, having said that, I think none of this is a one size fits all. If this is something that works for one person, it might not work for the other person. So I do sort of set that disclaimer out as well. So reframing self-care and productivity has been something that has been quite prominent in these conversations, because when we talk about self-care, um, a lot of people are saying that the ways that they used to look after themselves are not accessible anymore. So if my idea of self-care is to go out for a cup of coffee alone or with friends, I can't do that anymore. So how do I look after myself? What does my self-care look like now? So you are having to completely modify things from scratch. And we do spend a lot of time to come up with this perspective of self-care, and then having to completely break that down and come up with something completely new is challenging. So I think what is important for us to do is, again, reflect on how we have reframed our own ideas of self-care, how we are making these adjustments to self-care and our own mental health. And as an extension of that, productivity, which um, I would say productivity as a concept is extremely capitalistic, because pre-pandemic, a lot of your worth as an individual was attached to how productive you were. And productivity means that you are doing something tangible, you're doing something of use to give back to either yourself or to society at large, right? So if you're not a productive person, then you're not a legitimate person, is what this idea sort of talks about. That you deal with your problems by being productive. That has completely been thrown out of the window. And having said that, I would say that people who do find solace in productivity now, there's nothing wrong with that at all, because all of us have our own sort of coping mechanisms when it comes to these very challenging situations. So again, whatever's working for you, keep doing that, carry it on. Again, reflect on why you're doing what you're doing. If I am extremely productive and it's making me feel a certain way, where is that coming from? What are the roots of that sort of a need, right? And same holds good for the opposite end of the spectrum as well, that if I'm not being able to sort of be productive, what is coming up for me? What is stopping me from being productive? So I think a lot of internal reflection is very important for us right now. And unfortunately, increase in numbers of suicide is something that I've been noticing in the news quite a bit. And this is something that 1 second. Oops, I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, um, yeah, a lot of painful stories coming across also with regards to the pandemic and difficult things that we're having to talk about. So yeah. um okay, I'm sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. So yeah, increase in the number of suicides, unfortunately. So the reason that could possibly be happening is that a lot of us are going through a lot of us are having to face a lot of realities of life that are challenging for us to deal with on our own. um, Having said that, because it is an important topic to talk about, I would also want to reiterate the power of community and support when it comes to these issues. So for all of us, it is a duty or a responsibility that we check in with each other as much as we can. We be there for each other as much as we can, because we have no idea what other people's experience looks like right now. And while they may put up a front and they may seem okay, but I think it's important that we really do spend some time checking upon people and just building upon that support in community, which I think is very, very powerful. So even if people don't have access to therapy spaces for various reasons, maybe they're not comfortable with the medium, maybe they don't have the finances for it, it's okay um, to sort of check in with them and to just be there for them. You don't have to give solutions, you don't have to give them any advice, you just have to say, I'm here for you, we can share the space together, and just ask them what they need. I think that's extremely important. So on the topic of suicide also, something that's very important, because we're reading a lot of stories about suicide, is the language around suicide. Okay, so all of us have at some point said things like, this person committed suicide, right? So what is the problem with that? The problem with that is that suicide is not a crime that you commit. Suicide is something that you can die from. So the alternative to this sort of terminology would be that this person died by suicide. This person lost their life because of suicide. So I do want to spend some time on this, is because we do have a group of people who um, will have conversations about this with other people, will have sort of reflections about this ourselves also. So which is why it's important for us to sort of take those baby steps, that whenever we have conversations around it the next time, we don't use words like commit suicide, we use words like died by suicide. It makes it more sensitive, it makes it more like non-criminal, because legally it's not a crime anymore. So we can't be sort of using that language with suicide at all. And if at all there's anyone who has a background in media, or is probably sort of looking for some sort of job or an opportunity in media, or even has someone working in media that they know, putting this across to them is very important in terms of how they report suicide. So I think making it a more human reportage, where you don't give out the names of the person who has died, you don't give out the way in which they have died, you don't give out any personal information about them, because that is under the Mental Health Care Act, is not recommended. So yeah, I think this is something that is very important, and I do use this platform to sort of just put these thoughts across, even though they may not be completely linked to what we're talking about, but in the grander scheme of things, very important for us to just be more sensitive and inclusive when it comes to our conversations around mental health. Okay, so all right, so we move on to the next set of themes that have emerged, and they look something like this. So unresolved anxieties. um, human beings are human beings are experts at repressing. Okay, so we will do everything under the sun to not deal with our problems till we absolutely have to. So before the pandemic, we had a lot of avenues of distraction, we had a lot of avenues of not addressing the problem, and now all of that has been taken away. We're having to come face to face with our unresolved anxieties. That is very, very threatening. It definitely is, which is why you can access therapy, to have someone share that space with you, share that pain with you, unpack it with you. You don't have to do it alone. You can access a trained professional who will do it in a way that is not as painful. So again, experience of grief and vicarious trauma. And with this, there is again an article that I was reading that said that all of us that we're all of us are feeling a lot of complex emotions right now. We don't really know what we're feeling, and that article said that what you're feeling is grief. and all of us are moving through the 5 stages of grief um, right now. And that also could be because of the vicarious trauma that all of us are being exposed to. So when we do look at migrants walking back home, these really long distances, just so much torture that they have to sort of go through because no provisions were made for them for their well-being. And being exposed to those stories is traumatic because you are vicariously living their trauma too. So that can be a huge burden for clients who are journalists, for clients who are on ground working with these stories. It has been a very, very prominent thing that we have noticed is vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma will then look very similar to the experience of trauma when it comes to flashbacks, it comes to lack of sleep, it comes to dreams that come related to these traumatic stories. So this is something that I have noticed is very, very particular to the lockdown situation, is the vicarious trauma. And finally, abusive homes is something that is very important, not talked about enough. And this is also happening in the context of the LGBTQ identities, because if you are in a household where someone or maybe your entire family does not approve of your identity, your identity there becomes completely invisibilized. So you don't have any sort of access to express yourself, and that repressing act of your identity is going to be very, very painful. So I think it's important also for therapists, training therapists, and just society in general, that we mobilize support for the LGBTQ community by putting them in touch with the community virtually, right? So just because face-to-face human interactions can't happen, that doesn't mean that they do not have access to community. So for therapists and training therapists, what's important is that doing a lot of queer affirmative work is essential, wherein you are educated and aware enough to put your client on a path where you know that, okay, this person is going through something really tough because of all the oppression that they're going through at home. Where can I send them for support? Which community space is going to be accessible to them? Are there people from the community that they can speak to, have a chat with, share their lived experiences with? So that's something that again is very important. If you are considering career in psychology, I think it's important that you do expose yourself to these sort of spaces and to these sort of communities as well, and where you could direct people. And if you are someone who is going through this, I am so sorry, and I do hope that you do have access to some sort of community support. And if there's anything that I can do, if there's any support that I can offer, you can feel free to write to me, and I will do the most that I can to help you out. Okay, so the last bit of our conversation today is going to be on how are we contextualizing diagnosis in the context of the pandemic. So diagnosis is a debatable topic for a lot of therapists and mental health practitioners. So again, if I go back to Yalom says that diagnosis is counterproductive in therapy. It doesn't serve purpose at all. So a lot of us will be surprised at this idea that, then what is the point of a diagnosis, which is a fair question to ask. So the idea here is that, when we look at a human experience from a very medical point of view, then we don't give respect to their experience at all. So if I am looking at someone through a lens of a diagnosis, I'm not looking at them as a human being. I'm looking at them as a collection of symptoms. And then I'm thinking, which box are these symptoms going to fit into? Yeah. So all the nuances that are inherent in their experience get completely lost. And when we then come back to the conversation on process, that process becomes inauthentic, because all the therapist is doing is trying to put the client in a box of a diagnosis, that, oh, this person is an autistic person, this person is a borderline person. You, in saying those things, are perpetuating a lot of stigma when you are saying things like that, because you're reducing the entire person's experience and existence to just that. Okay, so I do want all of us to reflect on diagnosis in general. And a lot of clients will come up to me and ask me, am I depressed, am I anxious, do I have anxiety, do I have clinical anxiety? And it's never a yes or no answer. It's always about, what does this diagnosis mean for you? What does this diagnosis signify? Does it mean that it gives me some solace to know that there is a name to what I'm experiencing? So what do we do with that? Does it mean that I can make sense of my experience, or does it mean that it becomes the whole experience that I have as a human being? So again, as another recommendation, I think what I would want all of us to sort of watch after our session at some point would be Anne Hathaway's episode on modern love. I think a lot of us may have watched it already, but that does a really, really good um, depiction of the experience of mental health. And there is a part where she says, I'm bipolar, right? So when you say that, and the way she said that was that, my entire existence is this bipolarness, right? So she's so much more than that. But then when she says that, it's everything about her experience comes down to that. So again, some food for thought for you to think about. And now when we come to obsessions, compulsions, and phobias. So why this in particular is because our idea of obsession compulsion is very closely linked to cleanliness. And now all of us are washing our hands a lot, and all of us are sanitizing a lot. All of us are terrified of going out. The grocery run is like a mission or a war that we go on, because it's terrifying to be putting yourself at risk of a virus, right? So what does this mean now for us in terms of a diagnosis? Because if we had to look at all of our individual behaviors with regards to hand washing, mask wearing, lockdown, not going out, not meeting people, if all of this was happening in a pre-pandemic world, all of us would be diagnosed with one disorder or the other. So why is it that this is not happening now? Because now this is normal. Now this is something that all of us are doing. So it's not a disorder anymore. It is something that is a part of our lives. So with this justification, we then talk about the role that context plays in the experience of our mental health. Because when we talk about diagnosis, and when we talk about symptoms, and when we talk about disorders, what we're essentially doing is that we are looking at it from a very scientific point of view, right? So how scientific is this? Because if just hold on. Swapna, I will just get back to this in a bit. I'm just almost done with this, and then I'll get back to you. Um, yeah. So, okay. So when it comes to diagnosis now, how scientific is this? Because when we look at it, there's such a huge role that a context has to play when it comes to the experience of humanity in general. So just because this is normal now, it's not a disorder anymore. So again, I use these words in quotes because I personally don't subscribe to these ideas of normalcy or disorder or symptoms, right? So we also have to acknowledge the role of our environment and our context that has such a huge role to play in our experience of mental health. If this were happening a year ago and a group of people were doing this, all of us would be diagnosed with some or the other disorder, right? So I think it's important that we again reflect on what is normal. The word, I think, is supremely problematic when it comes to conversations around mental health, because when we do talk about therapy, what are we doing in therapy? The person comes with a set of problems or symptoms. We sort of figure out solutions to see how they can be more normal. So how can this person fit into this idea of a normal person? And I think it's important that all of us sort of reflect on what normalcy even means. What is normality? Because from my sort of point of view, the way I see it is that for me, the word normal is just a statistic. It's just something that we do on a normal this NPC curve, and that's it, right? And if we really go into the nuances of it, I think it's something that is perpetuating a lot of oppression. Because we're talking about the possibility of a new normal, and normalcy does give us a lot of solace and comfort, but we also have to understand that it perpetuates a lot of marginalization. So even when we are looking at normal pre-pandemic, who were we marginalizing in that normal? Yeah, we were marginalizing people who were not productive enough. We were marginalizing people who were finding it tough to show up to work, who were not professional enough because they're having their own set of mental health issues. They were being marginalized. All of those things have been taken care of post pandemic or during the pandemic. Is that the normal looks very different, but when it comes to a new normal, we're still marginalizing a lot of people when it comes to that space. So if we talk about the overarching fear that all of us are living with, is the fear of contamination by the virus. Who is most likely to perpetuate that contamination for us? We will point fingers at people who are not sharing the same privilege as we do. So this is also a space, this new normal is also a space which is perpetuating a lot of casteism and classism. So a lot of conversations these days are happening around how people don't want their domestic help to resume work because, they're not clean enough or they're not hygienic enough. So in these conversations, we are perpetuating a lot of classism and casteism, which is again going to be a bigger enemy than the virus itself, right? So I think it's important that all of us sort of check in with those biases that we're carrying. We check in with those fears, and if we are going to sort of negate those fears to some degree, how can we do it? We can do it by being more human to each other as a society. So if we are worried about our own family members or our own friends, it's important that we're equally worried about people who work for us and people who are not enjoying the same privileges as us. So if I do have access to um, some services, or if I do have access to even a mask, for instance, can I give that mask to someone who comes and works for me? And can I make sure that they are safe? Just simply checking in with them and making sure that they're okay too. Because if you have your mental health, they have mental health too, and it's important that they look after their mental health as well, and you can show up for them and be there for them. So I think it's important that we check in with those um, biases, and we check in with our own privilege and what we can do with our privilege, because privilege is we can use it to make some good out of it, is just the sort of idea that I want to leave everyone with. And I think, yeah, that's pretty much all I have today in terms of the information that I have to give. Now, I think if there are any questions, any doubts, feedback that you would want to share, um, this would be a good time to do it. And I'll just go through the chat just to see if anything's come up. Okay. Um, all right. So when it comes to dealing with family members who are now not being able to cope with the lockdown or could be showing symptoms of a potential disorder again, what can you do to be sensitive to them, and what can you do to help them? I think first, understanding that you will not be able to be there for them in a way that a trained professional would. So don't take up the responsibility to fix them. That's not on you. The only thing that you can do for them is to put them on a path of um, help. So how can you direct them towards therapy or towards medication if that's important. So sort of acquiring information about it, correct information about it, giving it to them in a way that is sensitive, giving it to them in a way that is not threatening, and also telling them that I'll be here for you through this entire process is very important. So I think that would be a good way of going forward with someone who's a friend or a family member who is going through a tough mental health experience, is that you just, all you have to do is encourage them to seek help. And that's your only responsibility. It's not your responsibility to fix them, because you won't be able to fix them. So yeah, that's how I think would be a good way to help out. Okay. Another very interesting um, theme that came across was gender-based violence and accessing therapy at home. So it becomes extremely challenging to be in an abusive household, a violent household. And if you are in a space where you feel like you need help or you need some support and you're not being able to access that support, it would be a good idea to again have a safety plan. Okay, so looking at um, safety as a priority, that am I and the people around me safe? So having code words with people who are around you or people that you think could help you, so that they understand that when that word is said, you're sort of in trouble and you need help. So having those support systems is important if therapy is not accessible. Again, it's important to sort of look at alternatives when it comes to therapy, and what are the other ways in which I can access therapy. So therapists are now very open when it comes to their sort of timings. So do it at a time where you feel like you will be alone. Do it at a time where you feel like maybe everyone's asleep, or maybe it could be early in the morning. Do it maybe on a terrace, or maybe if you could sit in a car, or if you could go to the staircase or the neighbor's house just to go and pick up something. So I think that would be um, a useful way of accessing therapy when it comes to violent households. um, yeah, so interpersonal tension at home is something that is very common because of the lockdown, and because all of us are in sort of in each other's space, and conflicts are becoming a lot more common. And I think it's important to reflect on a bunch of things when it comes to safety and, just self-care for yourself. So looking at how are you resolving those conflicts would be a really good idea. So, how are those conversations happening at home, and how are you perceiving those conflicts? That generally our idea with conflict is that conflicts are bad and we should avoid them as much as possible. But I think conflicts are also important to sort of look at the growth of a relationship. And if there is something that we're fighting about, then, that says something, that particular thing that we're fighting about says something. So I think practicing empathy would be a good idea for yourself and for everyone around, that you sort of do exercise empathy by letting the other person know that you understand what they're feeling, and you apply the same empathy to yourself in terms of compassion and kindness to yourself. And with that, I think it's also important to have communication. So communication would be very important. Instead of just not addressing the issue at hand, talking about it is important, and that also will sort of foster a more positive personal space for you as well. And again, if that's not a possibility, then personal spaces in terms of, is there a corner of the house that I can associate with just for myself, where I know that nobody's really going to be disturbing me, bothering me, times of the day when I know that I can prioritize my self-care that time, because maybe everyone's asleep or people are working. So I think I can sort of do things that I really enjoy to do during those times. So again, reframing self-care for you during those situations is definitely top priority. But at the same time, just looking at what those conflicts are looking like, what would the resolution of that conflict look like for you, and would that contribute to a safe and positive personal space for you as well. Yeah. Yeah, so people who are struggling with family members or friends, close ones, going through something tough with their mental health, definitely suggest psychologists to them, psychiatrists if necessary. Educate them, tell them why it's important, tell them how it's going to help. Do it in a way that is non-judgmental, do it in a way that is empathetic. So I think that will be a good idea. Okay. All right. Do we have any more comments and questions? Okay, I think that's about it. Um, all right. So I think again, very important to sort of close the session for today is again thanking everyone for showing up. I think it's so important that all of us have these conversations about mental health and are mindful about the changes in our own experience of mental health and therapy as a process, and what that's going to look like from here on. So again, like I said, that in the beginning of the session, my goal was to sort of normalize conversations around mental health, demystify the process of therapy, and again, just give you some food for thought to think about, just various things that we do sort of take for granted, um, in our overall everyday life. So I have spoken about a bunch of resources today, which I will send across over email, and that can be circulated to all of you. So yeah, I think that's about it.
Thank you so much, Saniya. This was such an insightful, and I think it had the essence of clarity, which is so critical to take us forward. The more we feel that, okay, mentally I'm in a more clearer space, you actually discover more. And I think that is also a quest which we should take within our stride in a very sporting manner. empathy, of course, is so critical. And I think thanks to every participant, I think your questions really added a lot of value to the session. We will definitely be reaching
Absolutely.
out to the participants for any specific feedback. You never know, maybe
Yeah.
post session, a day or two down, since we are also looking at the closure of lockdown 4.0 and we are yet to ascertain the next step for all of us, I'm sure certain queries can uh, evolve out of the circumstances that we're in. And we will definitely be
Absolutely.
sharing any resources that Saniya wants to share with all of you. So that can be mailed to all of the participants as soon as possible. So on that note, we will call it a day. Saniya, thanks a lot. This was great.
Thanks for having me,
Uh,
sir. Thanks a lot.
this feels very light. You feel good. You spoke out. Even when you speak and other people are answering questions, they are definitely supporting someone else's queries too and someone else's
Absolutely.
space too. So thanks a lot for this. We will definitely
Yeah.
build on this session more in the near future. And thank you so much,
Great.
participants, for joining in. Have
Yeah.
a great time ahead. Stay well. Stay in touch with Saniya, as she pointed out. And I think let's talk about this more. Uh, be very, very, very spotting and encouraging about it. In fact, to be very honest, I was looking for the terminology mental health across so many government advisories that came up. I found exactly 2 or 3 advisories since March. They spoke about mental health concerning children, mental health
Yeah.
concerning general people. I was actually looking up maybe if in the stimulus package mental health features. Well, we need
Hmm.
to really advocate for that much more to bring it to the front line.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great. And again, thanks a lot to everyone for showing up and with all of your questions, very pertinent, important questions. And I do hope that this has left you with some food for thought just with regards to the general conversation around mental health that we're having right now. And again, just be sensitive to yourself and to others, look after yourself, be compassionate towards yourself. And I know these are really tough times that we're going through, but just the fact that we have this community and that we have this platform to just show up for each other is also a ray of hope in a way. So yeah, I'm so glad that we did this, and I'm looking forward to future sessions that we can have. And again, feedback is encouraged, so I will sort of send across my contact details and everything else that was mentioned in our session today, and we can continue our conversations there.
Thank you so much. Have a
Thanks
very
a
good
lot.
night. Bye bye.
You too. Bye.